Okay, look, it's the end of the week, and the big story around here is adaptations. For one, the Law & Order franchise has just been adapted to Toronto. For another, Netflix just dropped its adaptation of Avatar: The Last Airbender. Today on the podcast, do they work? The group chat is here. Let's go. I'm Elamin Abdelmahmoud. This is Commotion. I think the reasonable place for us to get started is with this. I think you just needed to hear it. I think we needed to hear that in order for us to get this conversation started. That is, of course, the iconic theme of Law & Order, the most iconic franchise of all time when it comes to the space of crime procedurals. It just launched a brand new series this week. It is called Law & Order Toronto Criminal Intent, which is many words and many names, and we're going to talk about what that means. Basically, the show stars detectives Henry Graff and Frankie Bateman, and they got a bunch of high-profile murder cases to solve because this is Law & Order, and you know how it goes. You know the vibes. The folks who are on the Commotion table have all seen the first episode of the show. They're raring to go about this. Amil Niazi is here. Cyrus Marcus Ware is here. Michelle Cho is here. Amil, Cyrus, Michelle, thank you for being here. I'm so excited to do this. Let's go.
Can't wait.
Oh my God.
Looking forward.
Anytime we get a chance to talk about Law & Order is a delight for me. Okay, so the first episode, Graff and Bateman, which is, first of all, a fantastic detective couple name, can I just say? They're investigating the disappearance of a crypto investor who vanished while on a yacht in Lake Ontario. He disappears, but of course, he's got a passcode with him. And the passcode is a passcode to potentially hundreds of millions of dollars. There are a bunch of suspects in the death. His wife is a suspect. His business partner is a suspect. A few of his disgruntled investors are suspects here. Amil, look, you're no stranger to Law & Order. You're the Law & Order walking encyclopedia, as far as I can tell. You're pretty familiar, let's say, with the blueprint of Law & Order. When you watch the show, how does it stack up?
Yes, it's true. I've seen every single Law & Order and all of the spin-off episodes, including the original Criminal Intent.
Yes.
It is a formula. Obviously, all procedurals are. We're so familiar with the, lexicography of procedurals at this point as a society.
Yes.
And this new one, it definitely follows it. It's like paint by numbers at this point. But, what's funny is that there have been so many spinoffs. At this point, there's like at least 4 versions of Law & Order on the air right now.
Yeah.
And yet this still felt like it was grasping a little bit, like the one-liners fell so flat. It was like I could hear the thud when they said them. And, I kind of consider Law & Order like the Prestige of procedurals.
Yeah.
If Law & Order is at the top, one of the FBI's or CSI Vegas is at the bottom.
Poor FBI catching a stray this morning, but okay, continue.
Sorry, the FBI's. There's so many of them. And I was really rooting for it. Like, I really wanted it to be successful. And I just felt like, even though they had articulated all of the necessary steps and they had said the things they needed to say, and the crime was perfect Law and Order crime.
Yeah.
It didn't quite get there, and it just really was like a Canadian version of an American show. That's what I felt. And we can dig into that a little bit more, but it really felt to me like the sort of the B version or the C version of the kind of content that I'm used to.
I love that 4 minutes into this, you're like, Canadian derogatory. That's really the reference point that we're getting at here. Which
I don't want it to be, which I don't want it to be.
I understand.
I say that with love.
I totally get it. Also, I think, like, Michelle, it changes your energy and relationship to a show when you live in the place where it's set. Like, continuity stuff happening in, like, I don't know, any Law & Order New York shows, I'm not paying attention. Continuity stuff happening in this show where, like, they're just crossing the street from Nathan Phillips Square, and I'm like, you wouldn't cross the street that way. It just simply that's not how that would work. And I'm just trying to get over that, but it's fine. That's on me, I think. What about you? What was your reaction to watching Law & Order Toronto, the first episode?
Well, so I actually really appreciated seeing, these places that are familiar to me. So
Yeah.
like Toronto, getting to play itself versus standing in for, whatever other North American city. So that was
Yeah.
probably my favorite part of the show. Although I did catch that, yeah, like where did they go across from Nathan Phillips Square to what? And how did they race there in like the 2 seconds? I don't know.
Yes.
Anyways, but really I think okay, so I'm admittedly not as huge of a fan of the Law and Order
No
franchise
one is
as
as big a
Emil,
fan as
but
Emil is. Yeah.
but I do, I've watched a lot of it over my lifetime because it's been around since 1990, I think.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was very retro to me to watch this, even though the storyline is super current or it's aiming to be.
Hmm.
You hear the like dun dun like the opening and the voiceover, and it just had a kind of retro throwback feel. So I don't
Yeah.
know if yeah, that felt kind of incongruous, like the nowness, newness, and then the throwback.
That dun dun is
Yeah.
so iconic that like I was willing to forgive a lot of things. Can we play it? Do we? I think we have it. Can we play it real quick? Thank you. It just restores something in the equilibrium of the world when I hear that sound.
Yes.
Cyrus, I have to say,
Serotonin boost.
immediate serotonin boost, 100%. Look, it's an interesting time for Toronto to be getting a cop show, Cyrus, because the city's mayor, Olivia Chow, she just approved this motion approving, a massive increase to the Toronto police budget after actually saying, you know what, we're originally not going to do this. How did you feel watching this first episode while this political drama plays out in the real world?
I mean, this is what we call in the biz propaganda, which is basically propaganda that is focused on cops. And first of all, I just have to say, I have never seen a show with so many T-shirts and blazers. What was happening with that? I don't know why there were so many of those everywhere. There were cops running. Just this idea that they were running all the time seems so unrealistic compared to what Toronto cops actually do. So it seemed like this is part of, them putting flyers on all of our cars and telling us that they need us to give them a full increase. Otherwise, they're not going to keep us safe. Now we have a cop show that will definitely give people the opposite idea of what Toronto cops actually do. I've never seen a cop run anywhere, and they certainly don't know Latin. So in the show, I don't want to give anything away, but they knew the Latin phrase when in reality, cops only need a grade 12 education and 6 months of training. So they're certainly not learning Latin.
Yeah, there's something about these cops, particularly Graf, who's like, the current would carry the body this way because that's how Lake Ontario works. Which I have to admit, Emil, that got me. I was like, oh, this is like a classic Law and Order ism. Like the idea of the cop who's like, oh, the current in this area of the lake goes this way. I was like, all right, great. I'm sold on this particular move, and it features prominently in how they may or may not find the dead person. Can we just talk a little bit about the Law and Order's approach to borrowing crimes from the headlines? I mean, the first Toronto episode has a lot of resemblance to the sudden death of a Canadian CEO. His name is Gerald Cotton. He had a cryptocurrency firm that turned out to be a Ponzi scheme. Emil, when you think about the relationship between the real headlines and how we watch them and digest them in forms like Law and Order, what kind of impact do you think that has on viewers when we're digesting the news but through this Law and Order lens?
Well, the whole thing about Law and Order is that these crimes are ripped from the headlines. That's that's part of the sell of the show. And again, it's been on for 20 plus years, so I think we're very desensitized to that idea at this point. We have seen depictions of, Jeffrey Epstein's crimes, Donald Trump's crimes. We have lived through so many iterations of real life gore and tragedy through this show and through other shows like it. What I think is kind of interesting with this is that we are not as used to that concept as Canadians of seeing some of our Canadian crime stories, depicted in this fashion and dramatized in this fashion. I think, for the most part, we're quite sensitive to that in our media and in our coverage of these types of stories. And, certainly, I've seen this debate pop up when it comes to the crimes of Paul Bernardo, for example, and, whether it should be dramatized and if it's appropriate to watch that kind of thing. And so that's a debate that I think will be really interesting to have as the season goes on, is how do we feel as Canadian viewers? Are we comfortable with the dramatization of some of our bigger tragedies. And, when a news story is big, a crime news story is big in this country, it's national news, and it is national news for a long time. And I think it'll be really, unique to see that. I don't think that we're quite ready as Canadians for something like, Barry and Honey, the bigger stories,
the Sherman murders,
the Sherman crime, something like that being depicted on a show that is a little bit corny and hammy and designed to distill something like that that's so big in 30 minutes or an hour. I don't know if we're comfortable with that yet. So that's something that I think will be really interesting to watch with Law and Order at Toronto.
Syrus, what Amil is laying out there is, I think, an important distinction between Americans and Canadians, because I think Americans have no particular discomfort with this. There's a long history of a crime happening and then it finding its way into some kind of dramatization, not that long after that happens. We tend to resist that. We tend to resist that as a culture. We tend to resist that as a country. We are a little bit uncomfortable with seeing our crimes sort of represented in this kind of glitzy way. Law and Order, this is the blueprint. This is the thing Law and Order does in order to make the crimes sort of seem as realistic as possible. Syrus, what do you make of Law and Order's approach to this idea of these are ripped straight from the headlines?
Well, the danger and the risk of the rip from the headline approach is that it can give people the impression that what they're watching on a fictional TV show is the actual outcome or details of the case.
Yes.
And we saw this, of course, when Law and Order famously covered the case of Mumia Abu Jamal, who's a Black political prisoner who was arrested in 1981 for allegedly killing a police officer in Philadelphia.
Mm-hmm.
Someone else has a videotape confession saying that they actually did it. But anyways, Mumia remains in prison. And when Law and Order did the show, they told the story, but made it that Mumia had killed the cop.
Right.
And so that then becomes part of the consciousness. Oh, in the case of Mumia, I saw it on Law and Order. He killed the cop, even though that's not what happened in real life. So there's a risk there that the fantasy or the fiction will be taken as reality.
Yeah, I think that exact risk is the reason why we avoid that. As a culture, I think that is one of the reasons why we in this country tend to resist that. And I actually think that's a really significant difference about how we approach our entertainment versus how Americans approach their entertainment. Michelle, we should say Law and Order has been successfully transplanting itself in cities and different locales a lot. Los Angeles, New York, LA, Chicago. It had a stint in the UK. How do you think the format and watching these stories that are kind of local-ish to Toronto, how do you think that's going to make Toronto stories appeal to audiences across North America?
Yeah. So the interesting thing about TV formats, and of course Law and Order is one of the most successful ones of those, given how many, we see this with all the spinoffs and, the fact that it moves around so much, is that it seems like it's a very generic thing and it'll flatten, local distinctions, but sometimes it can actually work to highlight those differences, the kind of specificity of the locality. It's this kind of pre-existing container that carries a generic formula, but it can also, through the contrast that viewers are making between the different iterations, allow for things to come to the foreground. Or, I mean, that's an idealistic way, I think.
Yeah, that's really optimistic, but I like it.
The possibilities.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this format container, though, it does make it more likely that the show would be picked up by other networks and maybe, syndicated on other channels. It brings Toronto into this pantheon of, gritty North American urban locales.
Yeah.
And so, so I can see the value of this kind of generic container or packaging to bring Toronto to, I don't know, other places.
I think we get the impression that Toronto is blue all the time. I mean, it's the blue tint on this first episode is in every scene, to the point where I was like, do I live here? Do we not have sun sometimes? I don't actually understand what is happening. Amil, last word to you on this. The show is being promoted as a all Canadian production, a Canadian cast, stories written by Canadian writers. There's a lot about that. Let's listen to a scene from the show.
Inspector Holness, are you still searching the west side?
Yeah, something about the currents.
Well, it's Coriolis effect, obviously.
That flash storm at 4 a.m. Now, it came in from the south. It's possible that the gyre could have shifted clockwise for an hour or so, then switched back. Yeah, let's go east, search the bluffs, Cherry Beach, Woodbine.
I take it you want me to call it in.
I do. Ma'am.
Amil, you sort of alluded to this earlier, but this idea of Canadian-made television that suffers from this perception of being like kind of corny, I think, sometimes. Does Law and Order Toronto live up to that reputation, do you think?
Well, I mean, his accent in that clip alone is like, search the bluffs. I do, ma'am. Love it. Love that accent. Immediately recognizable anywhere.
Yes.
I think there's two things going on. One, a series like this can be a huge boon to Canadian television. You know, if you think of the kind of star system that Law and Order has been for actors alone, you know, everyone from Philip Seymour Hoffman to Claire Danes has appeared on Law and Order at some point. A lot of actors got their break on a show like this. So it can be great for actors, for writers, for showrunners to have something like this be part of our ecosystem. Mm-hmm. So I think that you know, that is wonderful, and it's going to give us an opportunity to grow within that industry as well, because I think we have some room there to grow.
We do.
But I ask myself as I'm watching a show like this and reacting to it and feeling like it's cornier than the other Law and Orders that I watch, and going, is this a bias that I have about Canadian television that is making me think that it's corny and cornier? This is a corny show. So it's like, I think it's probably just par for the course. So I think what we have to do as viewers in Canada is like, give it a chance and put that bias that we have about our television aside. Because I don't know that it's cornier. It's just that this is a well-oiled machine in the US, and it's not in Canada. We don't really have anything like this. So I'm hopeful. And I'm also going to try and again, like, just like quiet my voice that's saying like, this is not good, Amil. Put on the American version.
Yeah,
let's give it a chance. Let's give it a chance as a country.
I'm all on board for that. Like, I'm not ready to give up on this show. I think I'm going to stick it out for the season. I will continue to watch the rest of the season because I am curious about how all of these 10 episodes sort of treat the idea of Toronto and crime in Toronto and Toronto as a locale for these crimes and these backdrops. But I agree with you that the same alarm bells are going off for me. I'm curious about what we're going to get to. My name is Elamin Abdelmahmoud. This show is called Commotion. Today on the podcast, we are looking at the big stories in arts and pop culture this week. Amil Niazi is here. Cyrus Marcus Ware is here. Michelle Cho is here. Look, I want to turn the page. It's time to get into Netflix's new live-action adaptation of Avatar: The Last Airbender. Much like Law and Order Toronto, there is a lot of Canada in the show, which is great. It was filmed in Vancouver. 3 of its lead actors are Canadian. Let's hear a bit of the trailer.
Aang, you must master the Avatar state. It can be the ultimate weapon. Or it can save your life.
Everyone is counting on me. How am I supposed to save the world if I don't know what I'm doing?
But imagine what'll happen if you don't even try.
All right, here's a background that you need to know on Avatar: The Last Airbender. It was a kid's cartoon that came out about 15 years ago. A lot of people think it's one of the best fantasy series of all time. It's set in a world that has mainly Northern, Indigenous, and Asian characters. Different cultures have the ability to manipulate one of the 4 elements: fire, water, air, and earth. And then there's Aang. The story follows a boy named Aang. He has special powers as the Avatar. He has to stop the Fire Nation's colonial tear of the world and restore peace. That's the general premise here. Cyrus, there hasn't been an Avatar adaptation that wasn't slammed. Like, that just has not happened yet at this point. Do you think this new version will live up to what fans have been dying for so long?
I think so. And in part, it's because they haven't gone with a whitewashed cast. I'll just, say the M. Night Shyamalan, that one was widely panned, I think, for good reason, because a lot of people connected with the fact that there were BIPOC characters, that it was, set in sort of communities called, like, ways that were familiar, and we were getting to see ourselves reflected in this way. So when it comes to a live action, we still want to see ourselves reflected. So this casting is very different, and I think that alone is going to help to drive interest in the story. And I think this is the one. I mean, I don't want to jinx it, but I think this is the one.
I love that optimism, because I think, like, the way that fans of Avatar: The Last Airbender have been waiting for just some kind of breath of fresh air for so long, I feel bad for them. They're the most, they're the saddest fandom I can think of, because they're like, the material is so good. Why can't we possibly get something that decent happen here? Michelle, the original cartoon was created by two white American men. They said they were largely inspired by Japanese anime and kung fu cinema. They famously left this project over, quote, creative differences. What kind of conversations has this live action series inspired, do you think, about how Asian and Inuit cultures are represented in this fantasy world?
Avatar will forever exist as a turning point, I think, in this discussion around race and casting. And this kind of, came up around the failed earlier adaptation that Cyrus just mentioned. I think that the Netflix series is really focused on trying to remedy that that failure by really consciously casting Asian and Indigenous actors exclusively.
Yeah.
And it's been really interesting to kind of see how that plays out. And it's an extremely Asian American, Asian Canadian show as a result, which I find super fascinating, given that this is originally a kind of Asiatic fantasy world that was dreamed up by two white creators, but now it's being realized in live action form by now an Asian American or Asian diasporic sensibility. But anyways, to go back to this kind of discussion in fan spaces of the concept of race bending, I think it set off, I think, an ongoing conversation and kind of a fan movement to try to talk back to creators and say, what happens when you change a character's perceived racial identity in a media franchise really matters. And it kind of reflects, it can end up reinforcing or challenging the existing kind of power dynamics, which are, held up by racial hierarchies in the real world. So there's some real stakes to this, like how you choose to represent even animated fictional characters. And so, I think Avatar was the perfect series to kind of pose these questions, because it's so clear in the original animation that this is a BIPOC world. This is actually a world that doesn't include white people. So I think for that reason, this Netflix adaptation is already a success, even if there are some hardcore fans who are like, but I still wanted this or that or the other.
I like that success can be measured through a bunch of different metrics, right? It does not necessarily have to be, hey, this series was perfect. It's just that it did something that the first few adaptations did not do. Amil, last word to you on this. Maybe we got 30 seconds here, but can you talk a little bit about long-suffering fandoms? Because we always kind of are stuck between who holds the real power. Is it fans or is it studios who are, sometimes not really listening to the power of fans? What does Avatar tell us about the power of long-suffering fandoms?
Well, I don't think fandoms should dictate content and the core of what is being made. I think it's important that we don't let people on the internet decide how a story should be told.
That's fair.
But I do think it's so important that fandoms have really allowed us to see the power in speaking up when something doesn't live up to the ideals that we have for it, the power in saying, you've cast this wrong, or, this story is important to us. It's important to us culturally. It's important to us, X, Y, Z, and ensuring that creators uphold some of the values that made those shows so popular and made that content so popular. And so I think it's a relationship that requires balance, but I think it's great that fans can finally say about something like this, we're getting what we wanted.
Well, that is a perfect place to leave it. We got to leave it there. Amil Niazi, Cyrus Marcus Ware, Michelle Cho, thank you so much for being here. You guys are the best. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Of course. Amil Niazi is a culture critic and columnist at The Cut. Cyrus Marcus Ware is a visual artist, activist, and assistant professor at McMaster University. Michelle Cho is a professor at the University of Toronto. By the way, Avatar: The Last Airbender is streaming now on Netflix. And Law & Order Toronto: Criminal Intent airs Thursdays on City TV. My name is Elamin Abdelmahmoud. This show is called Commotion. I just want to say thank you to the wonderful people who helped get the show on the air. We will be back next week. Hey, I hope to see you then.